Part of what makes fighting games so stimulating and challenging is that it features all different kinds of playstyles, attributes, and movesets battling it out on the same level playing field. You can have a fast and aggressive fighter go up against a resilient, bulky fighter, who goes up against an aerial-focused fighter versus a ground-centric fighter, sword or magic, weapons versus punches and kicks, countless interactions between countless archetypes. And yet somehow, with fluctuating results mind you, everyone has a fair chance at victory. Ideally, what balances one archetype against another despite having mutually exclusive properties are the rules and framework that govern the match, with the intent of being as impartial to its cast of characters as it can be. Sadly though, reality is often disappointing, as they say. Depending on the game, some classes may get away with more than others, and one that continuously, throughout multiple franchises, is viewed as the black sheep of the fighting game community would have to be the zoner archetype. In Smash Ultimate, zoners are among the most antagonized characters in the game. Ask any player who frequents the competitive scene who they dislike fighting the most, and it's extremely likely for names like Min Min, Samus, Snake, Wii Fit Trainer, Villager, Duck Hunt, the Belmont, Zend, or Olimar to join the conversation. Why is it that these characters are perennially disliked by the majority of players? For today's archetype discussion, we're going to answer that question. As always, if you're interested in learning more about archetypes in Smash, my good friend Mockrock made a comprehensive video on zoners a couple of years ago in which he discusses that very balance between personal advantages and universal mechanics in great detail. So after you're done watching my video, I highly recommend you check his if you haven't yet. Some of the concepts he brought up will inevitably echo in my video, but I'd like to believe the two of us are different enough to where you can fully enjoy our respective takes on the matter. With that being said, what defines a zoner? Like any archetype, the boundaries are going to be rather arbitrary, but for my criteria, a zoner is someone whose main source of pressure or win condition can be achieved through long-range, non-confrontational pressure. I know that's very ambiguous, so let's elaborate on it. In the eyes of most, zoning is synonymous with range. Anyone with projectile attacks would be deemed a zoner. Some may take it a step further and attribute anyone who can render large portions of the stage hazardous or unfavorable for their opponent, whether doing so entails usage of projectiles or not. For example, while stationary and mostly unresponsive, Steve's TNT block is primarily used to threaten the surrounding area through its imminent explosion, so following that logic, it is in fact a zoning tool. The only side effect of this train of thought is that it causes overlap between zoning and trapping. Most players will call Steve's TNT block more of a trapping tool than zoning tool. The way I like to differentiate a zoner from a trapper is their relation to the caster. As covered in my video on the class, the key strength of a trapper's moveset is their ability to act simultaneously with the move in question. So going back to Steve's TNT, while it's priming up to explode, Steve is free to do whatever he wants, usually predicting what your option will be after taking into account the options that he thinks you wouldn't take because of the TNT. So in a way, a zoning attack is active pressure while a trapping attack is passive pressure. Traps also tend to have the ability to be used against the one who set it to offset the sheer situational advantage it would normally give. Again, depending on if you want to split hairs, some moves may be used for both trapping and zoning, but typically, trapping moves are meant to be used specifically while zoning tools are more general. It's a classic square quadrilateral square type deal. A textbook example of a zoning tool would be the charge shot projectile and its many variants. The longer you store power before launching the projectile, the more speed, range, and damage it has. Projectiles generally travel in a fixed path, most of them fire straight, some may fire in an arc, some go outwards before returning back, so on and so forth. Where zoning projectiles forfeit responsiveness, they make up for it with immediate guaranteed pressure. Regardless of strength, size, speed, or function, projectiles are extremely useful tools in fighting games by virtue of controlling space. Coming in contact with one 99% of the time will lead to a negative outcome for the opponent, and so they have to respond to that projectile within a set time frame. Timing is one of the most influential yet inconspicuous aspects of Smash. Given that moves and countermoves occur in a matter of frames, a split second can make all the difference between a favorable or unfavorable result for either side, and so, a major part of competing in Smash is to adapt to your opponent's tempo while at the same time preventing them from adapting to yours by mixing it up, going from slow to fast, delayed to immediate, action to no action. Projectiles can lead to situations that force your opponent to take action whether they do or don't want to at that particular moment, and with how much space they can threaten, it also restricts the number of safe actions they can take. For instance, if Samus launches a charge shot in your direction, if you do not make a move within the next few frames, you're going to take heavy damage and possibly lose your stock if sufficiently wounded already. This means you have to deal with that projectile, whether shielding it, dodging it, jumping over it, or for those countermeasures to projectiles like reflectors or absorbers, that's also an option. But whatever option they take, they must do so very soon so as not to get blown to Kingdom Come. Technically, every move has to be responded to immediately, whether a short-range punch or a long-range missile. But the key distinction is that zoners can exert that pressure from a far enough distance to where they face no adverse consequences to using them, meaning the end result of using a projectile will only ever be neutral or positive for them, compared to short-range attacks which can procure a negative end result since the opponent is close enough to punish careless use of it. Because of this, the onus falls on the opponent to get close enough to the zoner to equalize that scenario, to create that risk of using a projectile carelessly. It's this specific interaction disparity that gives rise to the zoner playstyle. Theoretically, anyone with a projectile can behave as a zoner. It's one of the many reasons why they're so valuable in Smash. Like I said before, no matter how weak, how slow, or how small, every projectile instantiable by a character is designed to be hazardous to the opponent. So if you're really committed to it, a character like Mario can be a zoner even though Fireball is generally not referred to as a zoning projectile. The reason Mario players don't is that merely spamming Fireball is not as efficient as the alternative. Therefore, determining if a character has a zoner playstyle is if exclusive use of projectiles can and does have adequate payoff in relation to their other options. Zoners and by extension zoner playstyles are those with a big enough incentive to do so. The payoff of zoning as Mario or Falco is not as worthwhile as the payoff of zoning with the Belmonts or Duck Hunt. Taking a look at a character that isn't explicitly called a zoner but plays very much like one, Wii Fit Trainer. While a number of their attacks have decent power and speed and can rack up a lot of damage in a short time, especially in tandem with deep breathing, their poor effective range means there's a heavy risk to playing close quarters, which is why so many Wii Fit players opt for camping in the corner, repeatedly chucking headers and sun salutations, which have a more favorable risk to reward ratio as they not only accumulate a non-negligible amount of damage, but those projectiles force the opponents to come to them, exposing themselves in the process. Naturally, the more threatening the projectile is, the more likely the opponent will feel pressure to stop you from using them. But once again, even weak projectiles like Fireball, Power Wave, and Blade Beam still make people approach, since if they don't, you will eventually win through a percent lead, and that's both the greatest strength of a zoner and the reason they're so frustrating to fight. Zoners are possibly the only characters in the game that have a tangible advantage against their opponent in neutral. Neutral is supposed to be the game state where neither player has a situational advantage over the other, with the main goal for both of them being to find an opening to acquire an advantage. On paper, this should be an even distribution of the three game states: advantage, which is positive, neutral, which is neither positive nor negative, and disadvantage, which is negative. Due to their zoning properties, however, neutral is always a positive for zoners. In other words, they have two positive game states in contrast to everyone else's one. Why neutral is a positive for them is because it affords them the freedom to pressure their opponents without fear of retaliation. For other characters, the reason neutral is neither good nor bad is because any action they take has the potential to be met with equal action from the opponent. The one exception to this is projectiles. That is, of course, unless the opponent has a reflector or some kind of anti-projectile option. Regrettably, not everyone does. Very often, the analogy of rock, paper, scissors is made in Smash, illustrating a selection of options that end in a win, loss, or draw. Zoners essentially have a win, loss, or win. In the grand scheme of things, the Belmont's axe is of little danger to you from a far distance as you have plenty of time to see it coming and avoid or block against it, resulting in a draw. But unless your name is Robin or Hero, there's no drawback to excessive usage of projectiles in this game. Characters can throw them as many times as they want. So hypothetically, if you're standing on the far left of the stage against the Min and she's on the far right of the stage, she's in a position where her attacks can strike you while your attacks can't strike her, thus putting her at an advantage even though you're far enough away to react to them. Eventually, you will have to get close to her if you want to exert pressure. Should this neutral game state persist for the entirety of a match, even a single % of damage you take will result in a loss by way of the game's competitive ruling. All that's to say, while other fighters have to actively pursue an advantage state in order to work to victory, zoners can do the same thing through both advantage and neutral. That's not to say zoners are infinitely better than every other class, but this video isn't about why zoners are the best in the game, it's about why they're the most frustrating to go up against. They're frustrating because they have the advantage by default, putting even more pressure on you to optimize your advantage state, since the more you play neutral, the more you're actively losing against them, and this concept affects everyone, from slow to fast, tanky to squishy, doesn't matter. Such universal application leads to players accusing zoners of taking no skill, not having to learn the intricacies of neutral such as the aforementioned adaptation of player tempo, learning how to space their moves to minimize the chance of being punished, etc. Zoning tools, whether correctly or incorrectly, are viewed as a one-size-fits-all in neutral for how all-encompassing they are and how they immediately put the opposing character behind the 8-ball. For instance, you don't have to concern yourself with unsafe attacks on shield, as not only are you simply too far away to be attacked, but your opponent has to focus on dealing with the projectile first. Building off of that, because of how integral zone control is throughout all stages of a game, from when the announcer says go to last stock last hit both players at 200%, zoners can fall back on the same exact playstyle or flowchart pretty much the entire time. Several projectiles, particularly those on zoner characters, have enough kill power to where eventually they either will threaten your stock if you get hit by them, or allow the user a low-risk way to follow up with a kill move. If he elects to, Mewtwo can spend the entire time throwing Shadow Ball at you. At low percent, it's very good for racking up damage, while at high percent, it flat out kills. Not that Mewtwo is a zoner, it's just an example of what he can do. Even for projectiles that aren't exactly known for their kill power like Young Link, they can set up for moves with kill power. At low percent, a common 1-2 combo in Young Link is Boomerang into forward air. Players continuously chuck side B until one of them successfully lands, then run in with the forward air for some good damage. The same combo can also work at high percent, and there's very little if any risk to using them. For someone like Mario to find his stock with a stray hit, he has to expose himself to the equal possibility of being struck too. Mastery over Mario is knowing when is it least likely for you to get punished for throwing a move out. This also applies to sword fighters who have to open themselves out to counterattack, albeit with a more lenient margin for error. Unless using them up close, projectiles have zero chance of punishment. Going back to Young Link, he can repeatedly toss arrows and boomerangs and bide his time until one of them leads into a clean forward or up air. Or if you have a projectile that outright kills, then you have every reason to avoid directly engaging with your opponent and just spam that projectile until it eventually kills. Many of them do that. That is why zoners are among the scariest opponents in last stock last hit scenarios. It all goes back to that implicit advantage they have in neutral. A common argument in defense of zoners is that they tend to falter when in disadvantage themselves, with many of them having subpar frame data and usually below average recovery. That is in fact true. The one exemplifying this the most is Min, who has without question some of the best stage control in the entire game. Ask anyone how does one beat the matchup, and they're almost always going to say to throw her off stage and try to gimp her or get up close and personal to where the majority of the roster has superior frame data. While that is accurate, that's assuming you can pull that off, with Min constantly pelting you with arm attacks from literally across the stage. For a huge portion of the roster, such an attempt is just not possible. Under no circumstances can Ridley, Byleth, Peach, Ike, what have you ever get within half her striking distance, let alone the full amount, and this goes for most of the zoners. Just by existing, the ball is in the opponent's court to equalize the matchup. What ends up happening is that just from trying to get within range to attack a zoner, you've likely sustained a decent amount of damage from the stray projectiles you ran into. So even if you get close to your opponent, you might still be in a losing position since you're at 80% while they're at 0. All they have to do is knock you away from them to repeat the cycle, and doing so is the trivial matter on account of those projectiles negating a huge portion of their available options. Charge shot fighters are aware of the pressure the neutral B has, and that many players will more often than not jump towards you to get close to you while getting away from the potential area where you'll attack. In response, they call out their jump with a rising aerial. Alternatively, the opponent might try to slowly inch their way forward by walking up and shielding, but in doing so, they render themselves exposed to getting grabbed. There's also the psychological aspect of fighting a zoner. After being incessantly bombarded by projectiles, players will understandably grow frustrated and impatient, which makes them play more recklessly, which then makes it easy for you to punish them since they're making a beeline straight towards you in the same way every time instead of mixing up their timing and approach. All in all, zoners are frustrating to play against because they, and by extension their moves, force the burden of action on you. Combine that with the notion of having a very straightforward yet extremely effective game plan that works in every scenario, and it's pretty obvious why everyone dies inside when they have to fight a Wii Fit, Samus, Belmont, Olimar, so on and so forth. They're not only encouraged to, but are actively rewarded for not directly engaging with the opponent. Pragmatically, it makes perfect sense for someone with powerful projectiles to spend the entire game running away and chucking whatever's in their arsenal. Why wouldn't they? It's no risk, all reward. Everyone else has to risk their life trying to kill you while you don't have to risk your life trying to kill them. Anyone in their right mind would take the guaranteed option. I don't blame them. But that doesn't mean I don't hate fighting them though. I know it's ironic. I mean a sword fighter with a projectile, pot calling the kettle black. Anyways, that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed the video. Be sure to watch Mockrock's video on zoners once you're done with this one. As always, I'd appreciate it if you could leave a like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at VarsFam, join my Discord server, and check out my other archetype discussions if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.